I'm excited to go along the route here, Mel.
Okay, we'll see. What happens, happens.
All right.
Okay. Okay.
So let's just start off by having you describe your experience at Chenard and who were the cast and characters at that time, you know? It's just about your own experience.
Sure. You know, Chenard, I first heard of it when I first got to Los Angeles in 1955, when I'd gone into an art supply store on 7th Street, and I just asked about, you know, art in schools, and one of the people there told me the name of the school and that it was around the corner. I really didn't have anything to do with Chenard until many years later. In fact, you could say 10 years later, directly, and that was 1965, when I started to teach there. In between, I met people, you know, who'd gone to Chenard. In particular, Danny Johnson, Ron Miyashiro, I think Virginia Jaramillo, and I guess William Bruin. I'm guessing some of these because I met them all together sort of through Danny and Ronnie, and then various people who had taught there like Connor Everts, and I'm not sure of Jerry Nordland. I think he may have had to do with the school. That's on my memory, but I met him with that same group of people around that period. And all of this would have been in the early 60s, this part. You could say Danny and Ronnie were my introduction, constant introduction to Chenard people. Like the War Babies, and Ronnie was a part of, Joe Good and Ed Burrell and Larry Bell. I saw their picture and I heard they went to Chenard, but again, it was the artier art school in reputation, as far as I know. You could say Bohemian, which was preceding Beatnik and Existential, but I guess it was probably all in the air at the same time. But it was the art school, arty art school in Los Angeles. Then you could say, when I started to teach there, I met a lot of people. Ed Reep, I'm trying to remember, John Canavier. Well, there were a lot of people. Canavier taught at the same time that I did. He taught Introduction to Art, which was a kind of materials handling course, and I taught sculpture. And the year before I taught there, Richard Hunt had come out from Chicago, and he taught there a year. So as far as I knew, he was the first black person to teach at Chenard. And I was a sculptor who also worked in metal, and I was just starting to be known in Los Angeles. I had my first one-man show in 1965, and Connor Everts and Jerry Nordland suggested that I apply to Chenard, that they needed a sculptor, and Hunt would be going back to Chicago, and you know, I should apply. And so I did. I said, well, Connor Everts was leaving Chenard under pressure, you could say. In other words, they were getting rid of him, and I knew it. So I said, well, hey, why am I going to go over there if they're going to get rid of you? And he says, well, the reason they'd hire you and the reason they get rid of me are different. And we were very good friends, along with some other artists like Marvin Hardin, you know. Anyway, Chenard was interesting because it had people from everywhere, from the Mexican community, from the generations before. It had a history. Much of this I found out by being there and teaching there, you know. So it had a history of people like Siqueiros from Mexico being there in the 30s, I think it was, but certainly, either 20s or 30s. Nellie Chenard, the woman who owned the place, was a kind of legend. It was a lot of stuff, a lot of people. All of a sudden, details are sliding away when I should know them. Man Ray came and did a lecture while I was there, and he had been at Chenard in the 20s, I think. And so, because there was a retrospective of his work at the County Museum, so he did this lecture in Chenard's, I forget, sort of courtyard room, and he pointed at a particular wall and said, under that wall surface somewhere is a mural by Siqueiros, because Siqueiros and the students had painted it there. And Chenard in LA had that kind of history. It was dynamic in the 30s, it was dynamic in the 40s. Richard Rubin was a very fine Los Angeles era painter who taught, I think, Danny and Ronnie and others, they certainly knew him, who had moved to New York in the 60s, but he was very much on the minds of Chenard people still, Is it all right if I pause for a minute?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because there's a name, why can't I think of it, and I want to very, very much. Japanese painter, did Ronnie or Danny mention a painter? What's his name? No, that's a real one. There's no way I should.
I'm just gonna pause.
Had gone to school was Nobuyuki Hadeshi, and there was a painter in New York, Mike or Matsumi Kanamitsu, and Matsumi, or Mike as most people called him, was teaching at Chenard when I was there. So he and I often, had lunch together. Canavier and I had lunch together. Those were the people that I was, as I remember, I was closest to, But the Chenard people were all over Los Angeles, and you always ran into people who'd gone to school there. Say if I was there in the art world in LA from 62 to 67, active in the art world, Chenard people were probably the most prominent in my memory, Now, I was a student at USC, and they were a different group, They were Francis D'Erdely, the painter, Keith Crown, the painter, Edgar Ewing, a painter, And often teachers from one place at one time or another were at the other schools. And the models that we all used worked at all the art schools and stuff. So, but the reputation in Los Angeles was, art was from Chenard, and the other schools were coming, sort of after them. Otis was strong, but people felt it was stronger traditionally and in terms of design, in terms of art. But the truth is, various people from places became good or they didn't, or continued or they didn't and showed up other places, so. But there was more a mythology or what do I call it? A reputation from Chenard, it's like if New York in the early years, you said Art Students League. There were other places in New York that people studied art, but it kind of had the reputation, the place that people touched. So maybe it was an equivalent. Anyway, I liked my experience there, and it was interesting because the Disney Corporation had taken over. I think they had bought it from Chenard, Nellie Chenard, but they hadn't taken over completely because they hadn't built their new unit in the valley. And so, for instance, the free speech movement and the kind of college-age art activism was heating up in that period. So what was going on in Oakland and Berkeley was also going on in Los Angeles. And the students at Chenard were, they were art students, so they were going to be involved in some things that were radical or changing things. And for some reason, they weren't happy with the Disney idea. And so they occasionally would protest that Disney now owned the place. And the way of doing it was, since a lot of animator types were there, or, a general interest in that realm, they put together a mimeograph, because that was the copy system in those years. A mimeograph, sort of satire, using many of the Disney characters, Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, and Mickey Mouse French kissing Donald Duck in the beak, and Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse rolling around all over each other, having a good sexual time. And, and then they sent it to Disney's, and you could time the mail in those years. So it arrived at Disney's place at a very inconvenient time. And I think he died in the next year. Some like to say, well, they kind of helped push him along. I wouldn't go that far, but I'd say because the Disney complex was a structure in the art world, it was a structure to be rebelled against, And my students were doing fairly aggressive things, and remember we did a show, and the show was in the part of the school that the administrative offices were also in that exhibition area. And somebody used a toilet and some other things in the exhibition. And I got a call from the office about my students and what they were doing. And I just said, they're students and they're experimenting, Then I had a talk with my students saying, it's good if you understand the context of where you're exhibiting, whether you want to go with it or against it or say something else. But it's good that you are aware, of what it is, both in political, social, and other implications, Because it was an interesting period, And people were doing and working in a variety of ways, And you could say people who came out of Chenard, like Larry Bell, reflected the influence of teachers who were interested in what we called hard edge abstraction. I think Frederick Hammersley was one of the teachers, and his influence was there. There was Ed Reep, who was, if I remember correctly, a more figurative painter. There was Herb Jepson. Herb may not have been teaching there any longer, but he had been a part of the Chenard history, along with Edmund Cohn. Edmund Cohn was a painter and was there. Ed was a very good friend of mine, but I was working at Chenard when he wasn't. He was of the generation ahead of me, and his brother was the sculptor better known in New York in those years, Gabriel Cohn, but Gabe had moved west. So he was a part of the Los Angeles art world. And in a sense, I guess that's it. For me, Chenard was just very much a part of the art world. You could say when they hired me, they plucked me out of the art world. They didn't pluck me because I'd gone to USC, though that was certainly major part of my guidance, in terms of art and stuff. But Chenard just kept being present, and it was very good for me to be there. There was a group of students from Texas in that period who were white and from Texas, and so we couldn't have had to do with each other in Texas, but in California, it was a different world, and we did, that kind of thing. Many of them went back to Texas and stuff. There also was a group of them at USC. So clearly people from Texas need to get to California, and Chenard was one of the places that received them, You got another one? Another question? Another question?
I'm just gonna let you talk.
No, it's because I need some guidance. So
Okay.
yeah, just
you know what
to do.
I'm really interested in,
Mhm.
Mel, is what set Chenard aside from other institutions, other places. You know the myth. Tell me about this. You know,
Well-
it's like the school.
Well, it was the art school. I mean, in other words, as if the art world was a different place, part of this different planet we call the art world, which, of course, there's no such planet. It's just people that get together who are generally headed toward this occupation and way of life. Ways, plural, of life, plural, because there are many different ways that people lived. And some artists live very normal shirt, pants, jacket kind of lives. And others were blue jean, t-shirt, James Dean, Hollywood influenced. Others were just working class Americans in the various ways. Those of us from the black community, we had our approaches and aesthetics, and all of these things moved around. The Mexican community was present there, and influenced things, through the artists who'd been there earlier, and just through the numbers of people in Los Angeles. And in that part of LA, it was very much a mixed ethnic community. I don't know how long it had been that way, that's something else, but in that period it was becoming a focus area for people from other places, in the region. But California was that anyway. California was very much from the 30s, people from Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana went there in the thousands, probably millions, out of the Dust Bowl and the Depression. And then people came after World War II, people who've been brought out for the defense industry and that sort of thing, in the early 60s, before I taught at Chenard, I worked at an animation house, Graphic Films. And Graphic Films hired people out of all of those art schools and out of the universities as well, because UCLA and USC and what do you call it, Los Angeles State College, all of those art center school, all of those contributed to the mix. But Chenard was the one that was arty. I mean, that's my way of saying it. But, it was more bohemian, it was more open, and that was a reputation that was considered positive. It wasn't a negative, it was very positive, in that sense, because it meant you were focused more on art than anything else, even in lifestyles and stuff, But the art departments in the other places were small versions of that, but it was a whole school that way, At least that was the idea. Dig me another Chenard question, and I'll get to other stuff.
What made it a great school in your mind? Was it the approach? Was it the teachers? Was it the interest of the students?
It was a combination of students, teachers, and their own drive and how they fit the dynamics of the time. There were people who were conservative. There were people who were aggressively interested in the new. Some were very art, fashion conscious. Others were, very serious. Some people were colorists, as painters. Others considered good drawing the dominant thing. There was an institute that lasted a few years, and it involved Herb Jepson, who I think was from Chenard, but Francis D. Erdley, who was my teacher at USC, and Rico Lebrun, and they were interested in the figure as a means of modern expression. So that was, I think it was called the Jepson School for a while, that sort of thing. But, they all got along. Edmund Cohn, who had taught there, was doing collages that used strange pieces of paper and dress patterns and were quasi-surrealist in my description of them. You know, you know, how would you say, the term loose cannon could fit a lot of people, and went especially to Chenard, you know, in what happened with them later and how they, you know. But when I say it was a great art school, you know, that's a hard judgment to make, and it was dynamic, and in Los Angeles, you know, who's to say? For some person, maybe Otis was, you know, and for those who came after I left, because I left in January of '67, and were part of the new Cal Arts, and the name Chenard, then, you know, you could say is mid-'60s and much earlier. And then the name Cal Arts became, but Cal Arts was the child or stepchild or orphan child of Chenard, you know. You know, and I say it that way because it just meant there was a change, you know, both in place and in dynamics. Because one of the things that was important about Chenard was it was close to the center of Los Angeles, of old Los Angeles. And so it's very much a Los Angeles. Then the Cal Arts became a part of the statewide, nationwide, international, if you will, recent thing. You know, it was the thing that carried, part of the thing that carried Los Angeles into the art world after the '60s. You could say the old Chenard gave it the La Cienega and the art world of the '60s, but after '70s, '80s, as it moved west to Santa Monica and became something else, you know. By then, Chenard, unless you said Cal Arts, you know, you follow what I'm getting at. There was an evolution of age and activities and interest, you know, which was different. But Chenard people were, you could be sure they were about art, you know, whatever way they lived and whatever they did, you know.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. There was another incident, sort of in protest. I'm trying to remember the word they painted. And when I started to teach there, the large room that I had for sculpture, I had a clear space, uncluttered, and had the walls painted sort of at one end of the room. And that was for, you know, when we had our discussions of students' works, it was shown in that space, so there was no distraction around the work. And one, I think it was a Monday, I came in, and on the walls of that space was painted in very large letters, "Disney sucks." I was bothered because they messed up my workspace. And it wasn't a period common, graffiti wasn't a thing yet, so you know, you weren't used to it. But I didn't mind them, you know, doing stuff, but not on the area that was for us to talk seriously about their work. But I didn't say anything. And at the end of the day, class was over and everybody was gone, and I was sitting there in that space reading newspaper or something. And at the other end of the room, a man in a blue serge suit, white shirt and tie walked in and was looking around. Well, it wasn't unusual that people would come and look around. So he was looking around, I guess, at work and stuff. But when he got to my end of the room, and he said hello to me, but his eyes kept going up to "Disney sucks." You know, he couldn't keep his eyes off it. But he didn't say anything, you know, which would have been the thing to do, say, "Hey, what's this?" or what. But he didn't say anything. And we just, you know, exchanged pleasantries, and then he left. And the next day I got a call come up to the office, you know. And so I went up, and I think it was Albert Cruz was the if not director of the school, the administrative supervisor of things. And Al said to me, what about this pornography or whatever on the wall, you know, in your room there, your students? And I says, oh, you mean the Disney sucks? I said, oh, the guy in the blue suit must have been here. I said, you know, I said he felt like he had to be connected somewhere. And Al laughed and said, yeah. I said, well, look. I says, he wanted me to do something about my students and that. I said, look, you know, stuff is going on and they're part of what's going on and they're going to do stuff. And I generally don't mind. I said, but I was more upset, not that they said what they wrote, Disney sucks, but that they messed up my space, which was clean and isolated for the sake of art, for looking at art, you know. So I said, but in terms of them, I says, I can't censor them in what they say or do. I says, you know, I work here as a teacher, not a policeman. I says, if you want to send somebody to see who's doing what and stuff like that, you can. But, you know, I'm here as their teacher and stuff. And it was fine. You know, the school really understood. It was, but at the same time, like any place, you have administrators and people who are concerned with behavior, you know. You know. But I say when you put, you know, behavior and artist together, you get thou art behavior and behavior thou art. You know. And of course, misbehavior thou art as well. You know. No, it was fun. I thought things like that, they weren't big things. Nobody was hurt. Nobody, you know. You know, they had student parties and things like that, and they were fine. Teacher John Canavier and I used to, as soon as school was finished, in the afternoon, would rush down to Long Beach, and there was an artist waiting for us with a boat, and we'd go out and go fishing. You know, it was the first period, the only period in my life I ever went fishing after work. That was wonderful. You know, things like that. Or it was the first